Welcome to Landscape Photo Editing Sessions. I'm Raita Arcuri. In this episode, I'm going to be editing a photo of Mauna Kea that I took from Mauna Loa. So the first thing I'm going to do to edit the photo, have it open in Lightroom, and I'm going to remove the vignetting in the sky. So a technique to make it easier to edit is to increase the contrast of the contrast slider and also use the tone curve and apply a strong contrast curve to the image. Alright, I'm going to go to lens corrections and change the amount of the vignette until it's looking pretty good. I'm also going to check the remove chromatic aberration and then reset the tone curve to linear and also the contrast. And to compensate for the shadows, this was taken during a time lapse, so I need a lot more shadow detail to bring out more of the foreground. And to compensate for the increase in shadows, I'm gonna increase the contrast and also reduce the highlights just a little bit. And then to brighten up some of the midtones and also sharpen, provide more contrast to it, I'm going to increase the clarity. And then to adjust the white balance more accurately, I'm going to increase the vibrance and saturation all the way. And then now I can adjust the white balance. So I'm going to make it a lot warmer and also more magenta to bring out more of those sunset colors. I can reset the vibrance and saturation and then increase it back up to bring out more color. Alright, now I'm going to open it in Photoshop. The first thing I'm going to do in Photoshop is remove the specks, that little blue speck, with the clone stamping tool. So I'm going to reduce the size of the brush and then sample an area next to the spot and then clone stamp that out. And the next thing I'm going to do is create a new layer and remove the lens dust right there using the same method. Notice how that the little clone stamping area that I just did is a bit darker than the rest of the area, so I'm just gonna do a exposure adjustment layer and press Alt click between the layers to make it affect only the layer below it. I'm gonna increase the exposure by around 0.05 and maybe a little bit more. So 0.07, and that made it much better. Okay, I'm gonna combine all those layers together, and now I want to increase the contrast of the clouds. So I want the light hitting the clouds around here a little bit brighter. So to do that, I'm gonna use a curves adjustment layer and choose the tone where the light's hitting the clouds and then choose a dark part. And I'm going to simply raise the brightness of the clouds part, the brighter part, and then invert the mask by pressing Ctrl I. And then I'm going to use a brush, a white brush, to paint in the adjustment back in. Okay, once I have that painted in, I'm gonna do another curves adjustment layer to increase the contrast of the mountain. So I'll do the same thing by choosing a lighter color and then a darker color. and then increase the midtones and highlights. And I don't want the shadows to be affected because they're already dark enough. So I'm going to invert the mask and start painting it in with a white brush. So I'm just going to roughly go over the mountain. I'm going to use a black brush to take away those areas that I kind of just went over. So I don't want it to affect the sky or the clouds below. So I'm just going to paint those away with a black brush. Alright, once I have those things done, I'm going to select both of those layers and change the blending mode to luminosity. So I don't want those curves adjustment to affect the natural color, so the luminosity fixes that. Alright, the next thing I want to do is adjust the color a little bit. So I'm noticing that the shadows are a little bit green, so I'm gonna use a color balance adjustment layer and just bring in a little bit more magenta. And then I'm also gonna bring in a little bit more blue. And yeah, that's good. Next thing I'm gonna do is crop the image. And then create a copy of all those visible layers, Control Shift Alt E. And then reduce the noise. So notice how there's lots of color noise and luminance noise in the shadows and the clouds from increasing the shadows so much. So I'm going to use a plugin called Noise Aware and just use the landscape preset. And finally I'm going to use a unsharpened mask to sharpen up the details that were lost from the noise reduction. So I'm going to use a amount of 250 and a radius of 1.5. And that'll make it nice and sharp. Alright, so here's the original image. And then I used a curved adjustment to increase the contrast of the clouds and also increase the brightness of the highlights. So where the sun was still hitting the clouds around here. And then I increased the contrast of the mountain. And then a color balance to make it a little bit more magenta, the overall image. And then finally a noise reduction and sharpening layer. Alright, thanks for watching this photo editing session. Subscribe and like for more.